I knew my dad to be a pretty good person, a person of faith. Um, and I had been taught to believe that people who were gay were like going to hell, right? And so
Mm,
I that caused me to do that kind of internal work. And while I couldn't work it out theologically to say I don't believe that's true.
right.
I knew it wasn't true, right? Like in my
Sure.
heart, I knew it wasn't true. Even though I couldn't say, "Well, this is why the Bible's wrong." I was like, "That just doesn't feel right." I have to
Sure.
figure out why, right? And there wasn't like this is before Google, right? So I couldn't like just Google this stuff.
What's up, beautiful people? Happy February and happy Black History Month. I'm your host of the Refuge Pod, Josh Lopez-Reyes, and I'm super excited today because we have an esteemed guest, the Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter. His remarkable commitment to spirituality, solidarity, and social justice has woven a unique narrative that embraces Black, womanist, and environmental ethics into his vocation as a pastor, professor, and scholar. So get ready to be inspired as you listen to Dr. Carter's vocational journey and some snippets from his groundbreaking book, The Spirit of Soul Food. And make sure to mark your calendars for the first of the month wherever you consume your podcasts, as we have a very exciting lineup of guests coming in the months ahead. So without further ado, let's dive in as we listen to the amazing Reverend Dr. Carter. So excited for a very special guest, the Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter, being on the Refuge Pod. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, just, we go back many years, and it's been awesome to see how life kind of brought us in similar circles, which is, that's how life is. But for our audience, would you please introduce yourself a little bit more of kind of who you are and what you're up to in this world?
Yeah, and I would say just to elaborate on the full circle part, like that's how life is to an extent for like scholars of religion of color.
Mm,
Like if you are
100%.
a scholar of religion and you're a person of color, you probably are going to somehow connect with a form for theological exploration, and that is pretty much it. That's how we all. I mean, it's the truth. It's how we all know each other. Either through
Right.
there or through HTI.
That's
And I
right.
work with both, and I'm not Hispanic, but I also work with them because, in terms of my just methodological approach, it
Mm,
involves a lot of decolonial thinkers who happen to be Latinx because that's where some of the best decolonial thinking has come from. So anyway, as a way to just kind of add some context to this, my name, as you said, is Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter. I am an associate professor of theology, ecology, and race at Methodist Theological School in Ohio. I am the lead pastor of the Loft community at Westwood United Methodist Church. And I do some other consulting work, anti-racism training. Basically, I have too many jobs, and that's kind of how things go. I'm partnered. I have a spouse and a son. That's the other thing that takes up most of my time. So yeah, I'm just living that good life, man. Living that good life, staying
that's
busy.
right. That's right. Well, thank you for that brief introduction, and I think it goes hand in hand, like you said, right? Being religious scholars and faith leaders, you know, many jobs is part of the I think job title of that. But really excited to dive in more, and again, especially to talk about some of your research, and also to talk about the anti-racism work, right, that you alluded to. But as this project and podcast really likes to dive into that inner journey, right, that kind of journey that whether we're in the Christian tradition or other spiritualities, kind of your own personal story and how it connects to the greater good and the greater world outside of us. But that said, would you share a little bit about your spiritual tradition and how it's shaped your life and worldview and journey?
Yeah, so I grew up with, I would say, like, middle, like not so much conservative Christian parents, but definitely not like liberal. They were kind of right in that middle ground of what I would say is they were Black Christians who were very much aware of the reality of racism. So they weren't just going to
Mm,
practice a Christianity that was going to reinforce racism. At the same
right.
time, they were okay reinforcing or practicing Christianity that did reinforce patriarchy and you know queer phobia. So and so it's not like we
Yeah.
were super radical when I was growing up. And again, I'm in my 40s, so I'm talking about growing up in the 80s. So just to add some
Mm,
context to this, like
right.
this is a little bit aging myself a bit, but I for me, I think when I think about my spiritual journey, I always talk about my grandparents and the ways in which my mom's parents, particularly, how their spirituality and spiritual journey really shaped me. My grandfather was a migrant worker, worked in the fields
Mm,
and worked in the factories. My grandmother was a stay-at-home mom, but took care of basically her kids and neighborhood kids. But there were people who consistently went to church. My grandpa was very, very involved in the church from a leadership perspective, from a music perspective, and he always had and cultivated an attitude of gratefulness.
mm,
And like he grew up in the Jim Crow South, and some of his experiences, that I've written about and talked about, sound like if you've ever read Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery, like it just literally sounds like post
mm,
emancipation America, even in the 1940s and 50s. Um, and and I think their commitment to just go. I remember going to church on Sunday, Josh, and like they would like, we had this thing called Joys and Concerns, and
mm,
and even if they had like a bad week, which some days were bad, some weeks were bad because just life,
right.
the black folks, right? And this is in
Sure.
the Midwest in Michigan, and you're dealing with the realities of racism. Like you would hear people say things like, you know, I'm grateful that God like woke me up this morning. Like
Mm,
I'm in my like right mind, and
mm,
that God allowed me to be here today and gave me like the strength, to be in worship today. And like you hear it, and they like this was coming from a real place. This wasn't like a pretend kind of spirituality. Like
mm,
they were grateful that God had allowed them the privilege of life for that day. And I think
mm,
that really stayed with me. And I think, when I think my spiritual journey is really rooted in a kind of gratefulness, a compassion for others, and kind of this pursuit of justice, so that folks can that so that we can actually live our best lives rather than kind of having to have that kind of struggle that my family grew up with. And so, yeah, I think my spiritual journey is really comes from them, and trying to live into that, their spirituality of being just grateful for what God has continued to give me the wisdom to be able to do in my life.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing. And I think it's really when I'm listening to you share about that, it really resonates. And I think kind of going back to communities of color, right? BIPOC communities, I think oftentimes we have this collective, whereas in Western culture, right, it's very individualistic. I think our spiritualities oftentimes come from our ancestors, right, our family, our people, and I appreciate you, bringing them into this space, and I think it's so powerful. The what you're talking about, this spirit of gratitude, right, that definitely have seen in my own ancestors too, right, where it's like you're an immigrant family, you're underemployed and but there's still this, hustle, but also gratitude, right, for being alive, like you said. And so really resonate with that and appreciate you sharing that. And want to ask if there's been, and it could be multiple experiences or pivots, right, in your own spiritual journey, but was there ever anything where it was like, I had a light bulb moment, or pun intended, come to Jesus moment, or anything, as you've been around, you mentioned for some 40 years or so.
Yeah, well, just say that. I mean, I will say I always could look younger until I had Isaiah. I got a 4-year-old son, and like that brought out all the gray hair. Like I had no gray hair, and then he was born in like literally 2 weeks. It was just like on my face. But no, there's a few pivotal moments I think are worth lifting up.
Hmm.
I would say in a general sense, I loved theology, and I could not have articulated that as a kid, but I remember like I as a junior high um like kid loved like the Bible. Like I wasn't like I wasn't people say, "Oh, I love the Bible," and what they really usually mean is I love my interpretation of the Bible. Like I loved reading the Bible, being in a conversation with people about what it means, and recognizing that it had multiple meanings. To the extent that when I was in eighth grade, from the time I was in eighth grade till I graduated high school, I was in the adult Sunday school class in my church, like because I was just interested in it, and they let me be in there, and that was awesome. And I think they're kind of nurturing that curiosity was a really powerful thing. They did make me feel
Mm.
like out of place in that
Mm.
space. I think the other thing that happened was my mom and my stepdad, who is like my father. He's the person who raised me. Like he's the person who I call dad. Like they got divorced when I was a senior in high school because my dad came out as gay, and this would have been the early '90s, and or I guess that would be mid '90s, I should say, and this is the end of the AIDS crisis, but still a lot of queer hate in the Black community.
Mm.
And, I knew my dad to be a pretty good person, a person of faith. Um, and I had been taught to believe that people who were gay were like going to hell, right? And so
Mm.
I that caused me to do that kind of internal work. And while I couldn't work it out theologically to say I don't believe that's true.
Right.
I knew it wasn't true, right? Like in my
Sure.
heart, I knew it wasn't true. Even though I couldn't say, well, this is why the Bible's wrong. I was like, that just doesn't feel right. I have to
Sure.
figure out why, right? And there wasn't like this is before Google, right? So I couldn't like just Google this stuff. I grew up in the era of actual home landlines, pre Google. Go to the library and look stuff up. So I mean, this is a
Right.
generational thing. So I just
Right.
was like, I'll learn eventually. But I knew
Mm.
this was wrong, and so I think what that allowed me to do and why that was pivotal for my spirituality is for me it pushed me beyond the limits of like my own particular tradition, so
Mm.
I knew I didn't have to be stuck in this, well, this is what my church or my pastor says and this is what I have to believe. I would say, well, this is what they say, but this is inconsistent with the other beliefs we have about loving all people, loving our neighbor as
Right.
ourselves, that we believe that God is a God that is love and loves all people and is just. And the fact that they would say my father would be punished for just being who he is seemed unjust, right? And
Right.
so that for me was one of the impetus to like continue to study religion in undergrad um,
Mm.
and in grad school. I would say the last transformative thing that really has continued to shape my theology was when I was doing my PhD. It ties into what we were talking about earlier about like decolonial thinking. The crazy thing about being and maybe you can even, I'm sure you resonate with this, but being a person of color and getting a degree in like a graduate degree is
Mm-hmm.
just constant exercise in having to not allow people to internalize dehumanization, because
Mm.
everything you are exposed to basically says that your people are not really smart, and not,
Right.
and you're here because you're not like them.
Right.
So
Right.
like you're here at the school because you're not one of those blacks, you're one
Mm.
of these blacks, right? And
Right.
so I had begun to internalize so much of this narrative of anti-black hate, whether it be
Wow.
intellectually because we don't study that many black scholars or African history, or that we prioritize scholars and writers and activists but they don't acknowledge their implicit racism what they write, unless you have the
Right.
eye to see what they're saying is racist, you just believe it to be true. And I
Right.
remember reading, and I knew something didn't feel right in me because I felt like I was writing and thinking in ways that was overly critical in my community that wasn't giving them credit for what they had done, but I couldn't really articulate it. And so I was really going through
Mm.
a season of my life where I didn't feel connected to um, what it meant for me to be black, quite honestly, in a very real way in this white institution while I'm in grad school. And I
Mm.
read Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. And
Mm.
I'm telling you, man, like I think it's his chapter on violence. It's maybe on page 10 because I'm
Mm.
remembering how I was when I read it. And he talks about how the bourgeoisie tries to basically teach the colonized intellectual
Mm.
to implant it within them the ways of thinking of Europe and to put sentinels, he says, sentinels on guard in the back of their consciousness that will defend that true from any other truth you might learn. And
Hmm.
it was like a light bulb moment. I was like, oh, this is what's happening to me. Like
Hmm.
they are trying to make me a colonized intellectual so I can go back to my community and essentially try to recreate a society that upholds some degree of colonial framework as a way of transformation rather than looking at coloniality, right? Colonialism as a big
Hmm.
part of the problem. And man, I'm telling you, it changed everything. Like, I mean, I
Wow.
created a decolonial method in my book based off that experience because I was like, oh,
Wow.
I couldn't articulate what was happening, right? But I knew
Right.
something inside me was just wrestling with not feeling like I was myself, you know.
Yeah.
And so yeah, from a spirituality perspective, those moments really helped give me the language to articulate what I was feeling, and then I could connect that
Mm.
to my understanding of God as a God of love and compassion, which has always been there. Like that's
Hmm.
always I've always felt like that. It just gave me the tools to be more integrated in my faith.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing those experiences. And yeah, that's so fascinating. We've known each other for a while, and I've heard you speak in other engagements. But I've also learned some things, that from your story, just in these responses. So I really appreciate you, sharing those experiences. And again, the purpose behind this podcast is because we all have different spiritual journeys, right? And we all have different struggles, and we all, are trying to put our faith into action into the world. But it's just really, fascinating to hear people's experiences and journeys, and I resonate with that too. That last part that you mentioned, in terms of, you know, um, it was tough, as being a first generation, college graduate, right, and also studied religion, and I was in a like a mostly immigrant Spanish speaking, very conservative church context at the time, and it was very colonial, right? Actually, it was kind of going after this like Pentecostal charismatic prosperity gospel, and we're like in this mostly immigrant, very very much under resourced community, and there was just things that didn't vibe or click, or also to the LGBTQ inclusion, right? Like there's a lot of things that didn't click, and I think it is really interesting you sharing that experience of kind of decolonizing, right? Instead of repeating the oppression, right? Or and so it, like, how was that experience? And maybe backing up a little bit, like you mentioned, you studied religion in undergrad. I know oftentimes they kind of prep you for grad school, right? But what made you choose? Like, because for a lot of us, we're the first, like you said, right, people to either graduate college or even pursue graduate degrees. Like what led you to seminary, and to pursue this as your vocation?
Yeah, so as United Methodist, you have to have master divinity to get ordained. And
Right.
I at this point I had been Methodist. My mom, we had switched from Baptist to Methodist when I was in like elementary school,
Okay.
and and it fit for us because we liked the structure. We didn't like the kind of churches where like the pastor had total autonomous power that made us uncomfortable. Um,
Right.
and and I grew up loving Wesley. I mean, the whole notion of sanctification to me
Mm.
has been beyond powerful. But I'm also a virtue ethicist, and so this is a way of me saying I talk a lot about practices that allow us to become excellent at a particular kind of
Mm.
skill. And so sanctification is in line with my whole way of thinking. And I don't know if it's being Wesleyan basically made me a virtue ethicist, or being a virtue ethicist made me more Wesleyan. I don't know. Those things kind of complement each other, but I did not actually. So I minored in religion in undergrad
Okay.
because I was like, I didn't know, man. I was like, I knew God was like, oh, I felt called, but I
Right.
was like,
Right.
let me just check it, maybe make sure. So I majored in business administration. I minored in
Okay.
religion
Oh
because
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I was nervous, man. Like I'm the first person to go to college in my family, as you said, first person to get a degree, and I
Yeah.
wasn't trying to like, I was going to college to get a job, and I
Exactly.
wasn't sure that being a pastor was the kind of job that was going to allow me to avoid being poor. And I grew up poor, and I did not want to be poor anymore. I was like, I don't want. I was just like, I don't want to be poor. And if I I have to figure out a way to avoid it. And so uh so that's why I studied that. And I didn't I went to definitely a conservative undergrad, and the religion courses were helpful in as much as I learned a reformed way of thinking. I learned how to appreciate what their theology was. But at this point, I had lived enough life because I didn't go to undergrad right away. I was like 26 when I graduated.
Yeah.
Um, so I wasn't the kind of person who could sit in the classroom, have a professor say, this is what it is, and me just
Right.
believe them. Because I'm like, nah, man, I've lived life, like
Right.
I know there's other, um, I know there's things you're leaving out. And these other little kids, that don't know anything, that just went straight from their gated communities to this private school, they don't
Mm.
know any better. I
Mm.
know better. so
Right. Right.
so I ended up at Claremont School of Theology because of financial aid. I had
Yeah.
offers to go actually had offers to go to other schools that would have been a full ride scholarship. But I chose to go to
Okay.
Claremont because my wife is white, and I didn't want to, we wanted to be in a space where we didn't have to deal with racism,
Mm.
and as much as we had dealt in the rest of our lives. And Los
Right.
Angeles was an ideal fit for us, in that regard.
Right.
Um, and so, yeah, that's how I ended up out here, just because I needed, I knew that, I knew prior to coming to seminary, I loved God with my heart. I needed to
Mm.
fall in love with God with my mind,
Mm.
and I knew I needed space to do that. And I knew I got I needed to leave. I need to, do like there's this, you probably, I don't know if you're familiar with the book of Richard Rohr. He has this book called Falling Upwards, and he talks about Odysseus
Mm.
and going on this journey. And he talks, we have to leave in terms, and like you have to leave to actually have this happen. And I read it, and I was like, yeah, this makes sense. Like you have to be in a space where things become difficult, and it forces you to grow. Um,
Right.
and that's what I did. I was able to grow because of that.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. And like to that end, right? Like I've heard, I'm sure you heard this joke. Some people call seminaries cemetery, right? Because they
Yeah,
go there and their faith dies. But I think that I think there is sometimes a death, right? There's a growing, like you're alluding to, right? That happens a lot of times because, to have that space, right? Like you're saying, that opportunity that very few individuals do, like, because we have so much pop theology and just like, especially, in certain communities, right? That to quite frankly, I think there we have this kind of crisis, right, in terms of and, people not wanting to be a part of like institutionalized or organized religious spaces, right, because of the pop theology, right, that exists in terms of associating Christianity with hate or other faith traditions too, right, with very colonial frameworks, and so like what was there a class, was there something in particular that like helped, you mentioned a book already, right, but like if you can draw a little bit more on that experience, because obviously you went on to pursue a PhD too, right, not just a MDiv, and I think you have what, MA, MDiv, and a
I got
PhD.
too many degrees, man. Too many degrees. You know what? What's so funny, Josh? I would say like seminary did not do as well a job as it should have done,
Mm.
um, in this regard. I came into seminary like, I mean, I kind of skipped over a lot of stuff in my life, man. So like, so my mom has lupus, and that's an
Okay.
autoimmune disease, and she got
Right.
diagnosed when I was 14. And life was hard, man. Like, we were already poor. We didn't know what was going on. We didn't have good insurance. She was in the hospital for months on end.
Mm.
We were getting utilities turned off. We didn't have we and and I was taking care of I'm the oldest of four, so I'm taking care of my brothers and sisters. While my dad is a janitor at elementary school, working
Mm.
in the evenings, and so I'm the other adult at home.
Right.
And this I was for years till we figured out what was going on with my mom and get her on a medication regime or routine, I should say, that allowed her to be able to come home consistently. Before that, like,
Wow.
my dad, like when my mom and dad were younger, my dad had a drug problem, and so he ended up having to
Mm.
go to rehab for 2 years. And
Wow.
so my mom was working like two jobs, taking
Right.
care of stuff, and I was taking care of my brother and sister then, um,
Mm.
and so like and my aunt and had been through difficult times that I had witnessed with respect to domestic violence. My grandmother, who has subsequently passed before I went to seminary, had a stroke and lost her ability to speak and walk well, and
Wow.
um, so we just I didn't live through so much at a young age. I've been working. Like
Right.
I was working full time 40 hours a week when I was a senior in high school, man. Like to help pay the
Right.
bills, not
Right.
like like to pay like light bills. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Right.
and so so when I got to seminary, right? So I give that as context to say
Right.
when
Right.
people are like, I get to seminary, Josh, right? And look, I'm in. I remember being in systematic theology, and there's this white woman, don't know her name, and again, my wife is white. Got no problem with white people, but this is important
Right.
for the context.
Right.
And she says, the problem I have with God is I just like struggle with the problem of evil. I don't know why evil exists. And this is my second semester in seminary. And this is my first time encountering this. Because again, I'm not around any intellectuals. I never heard of this problem of evil because I grew up in a black community where we knew what evil was and it pretty much looked like her, right? Like we have been like, okay, this is our,
Yeah.
white people tend to be causing the problems, right? And so and so like she's articulating this problem that I have a hard time believing in God because of evil. And
Mm.
people start talking about this, and I'm in the class with Philip Clayton, Dr. Clayton. And I'm like raising my head and I stand up. It's like, you know what? I have to be honest with you. I think this is a BS because, like, clearly you never talked to anybody that's been poor. I was like, because
Mm.
evil exists because people do evil things. I
Right.
was like, it has nothing to do with anything else. I was like, and I literally said, I was like, white people have done evil things in this world to
Mm.
my people. And this is when we can see how evil exists. And I was like, that doesn't mean anything. That has nothing to do with God. That's everything to
Right.
do with y'all. I was like,
Mm.
why are you putting our God stuff that humans have done? And
Yeah.
so I fundamentally always understood these things as choices. I said this
Mm.
to say like there wasn't anything in seminary that could happen. I was gonna take away my belief in the love and goodness and compassion of God because there have been multiple times in my life where I experience the divine intercede on my family's behalf and make a way out of no way, right? Like I
Yeah.
lived it. So I knew. I was like, so whatever problem you have about evil, that's your problem. You got to work out. I know, but I know it to be true.
Right.
Um and so for me that was powerful, but like I didn't get that in seminary, right? I brought that to seminary. And so
Right.
now as a seminary professor, when I teach theology, I teach intro to theology, which is essentially constructive theology. And I think that
Right.
is so often what's missing with
Mm.
seminaries. Is you get to a
Right.
school and they teach you how to deconstruct a lot of what you used to know, and
Right.
they don't help you like build it back
Build
up.
it up. Yeah.
And so what I do in my class, that's what their final paper is. Like the first half of the semester is let's ask a lot of questions. I didn't call it deconstruction. I'm like, let's wrestle with what you used to believe or these other beliefs.
Right.
Now let's think about what it looks like to build up and develop a theology that's consistent with what you actually believe and recognize that your beliefs shift and change over time, right?
Right.
Like what you believe now may be different in 5 or 6 years. It should be different. Like you should
Exactly.
grow, right? That's just a part of
Exactly.
what it means to be a human, right? But there
Right.
are fundamental aspects, like your faith should remain steady even if your beliefs grow, right?
Mm.
And so I'm trying to give my students, I'm trying to equip them with the tools they need to discern and distill what is bad theology, right?
Mm.
So that when they're building their new theologies, they say, oh, okay, I can ask critical questions. It doesn't cause me to lose faith. It causes me to, as Anselm would say, seek understanding,
Mm.
right? That is faith. Faith is seeking understanding, recognizing there's always more, and that God is always revealing God's self to us. And
Mm.
so I'm trying to do that in seminary, but I'll be honest, like I didn't get that. Like and so I
Right.
try to provide it, so that my
Totally.
students will have the same problems I had.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that experience, and obviously trying to be a solution, right, to this gap that we have oftentimes, right. And it's similar in, like, for example, communities of color, right, when you don't have teachers that are from the community, right, that understand the social realities, right. When So I really appreciate you, uh, holistically responding and like sharing a little bit about your story, right, and your family's experiences, and like totally resonate with that, too. Whereas, like, I feel like seminary for me was oftentimes, there was a syllabus of things that were instructed to read, but then I had to almost create my own syllabus and like bring in voices and other social occasions, right, that were not represented, and eventually construct a theology, really what I believed based on, the what I knew was true of the world, right, as opposed to kind of this, very limited social location that's often represented, like you're alluding to, right, and higher education in general, but especially when it comes to religious, higher education, right. And so grateful that we have people like yourself, right, who are in those positions now to teach, and right, to show other ways, and other voices that oftentimes unfortunately, like majority of most theological institutions are leaving out these voices that are so crucial and important. And to that end, I mentioned earlier we met almost like a decade ago now, which is crazy to think about. But you were just like finishing, I think, your PhD dissertation, and it was really fascinating, because I was going through this experience. Actually, um, my partner Gracia and I were there together. We are doing some like vocational discernment, and we were at this retreat center in the Bay Area. And you were a workshop presenter, and you talked about the intersections of soul food and faith and food, right? And really was the first time that you really, having, at that point been in seminary and really looked at like the theology of the Eucharist and things like that. And I eventually ended up writing my capstone project in seminary, really around the theology of the Eucharist, but really kind of looking more so in the kind of contextualization, right, of my own community. And it was really inspired by the work that you started doing. Like, I didn't know that was a possibility. So want to thank you for the work you're doing, and of course talk more about it. But also, yeah, it was just really, I even quoted you in the, in,
This
I
is so
think.
funny, man. You never told me this before. I'm like, oh man, that's. I mean, it's crazy to think about how long ago that was, though, right? Like when you said that,
Right.
I remember you coming up to me and just how excited you were, like to be like, oh my gosh, I hadn't thought about this. Like you had that on your face, like that look on your face. It's like I never thought about religion and food in this way. So that's so
Right.
awesome that you ended up writing on it.
Yes, no, thank you again. Like, and to what we were talking about earlier, right? Just to have, like, I think part of my excitement was to have somebody like I could relate to, right? Like yourself, which again, thank you for the work you do, not only pastoring but also teaching, right? In seminary, I think it is so crucial to have, more people like you, more people like us, right? To offer different experiences and perspectives, but definitely want to, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit more, what eventually became a book, right, that came out in 2021 through University of Illinois Press, The Spirit of Soul Food, Race, Faith, and Food Justice. Again, congratulations on this wonderful book. And like, for those who haven't had a chance to read it yet, could you give us a like an overview of what you're talking about in this beautiful book?
Yeah, so I went into seminary very interested on about race
Mm,
and not knowing exactly what I wanted to do beyond that. Like broadly speaking, I know I wanted to do something to do with like what we call racial reconciliation or
mm,
anti-racism training. I don't, I couldn't articulate it in that way, but I've always been interested in like identity and the way we construct identity.
mm,
Um, I decided to talk about food because of a trip I took. Well, I should say multiple reasons, but what triggered the idea was I was driving from LA to San Francisco for a conference, and in that drive, if you've ever driven it, you go along the five, and you just see like these. fields and workers and what looks like the
Mm.
just worst working conditions.
Right.
And Josh, it reminded me. So we would grow up and we would drive from Mississippi. We would drive from Michigan to Mississippi, and my grandpa's an introverted person, but this is the time he would start talking about like his life growing up when we were on the drive when we were down there, growing up picking cotton and picking all kinds of stuff and
Mm.
working in the fields. Um, and I connected with those workers, even though I didn't
Right.
know them. I was like, man, this is the same stuff my grandpa been doing. And like, and when he
Right.
talks about it, it was terrible and it was racist.
Right.
And I
Right.
saw these workers doing it, and I was like, this is terrible. This is racist.
Hmm.
How are we like? What's a theological response to this? That's all I was thinking. I was like, there must be
Wow.
a way for me as a person of faith to do something about this, right?
Right.
And the first thing I thought about what I could do at the time was how should I change the way I eat, um, in light of what's happening. And so, really, that's the central premise of the book: is how can I eat in a way that's in alignment with my values, right? If one of
Mm.
my values is like liberation and justice and compassion, which I think a lot of people of faith would agree those are some values they have, what does it
Right.
mean for you to eat in a way that actually is consistent with those values, right? And so to
Mm.
do that, I had to like disentangle the food system and talk about the structural racism in the food system, talk about the
Mm.
ways in which Christianity has enabled us to be complicit in that, in the way we think about the environment, because of the hierarchy we have about where humans are relative to other creatures, and how ultimately when we get to what we're talking about what it means to be human, it's often rooted in a projection of whiteness,
Mm.
when we think about like when in our theological anthropologies within Christianity, when we're talking about Jesus, you see images of Jesus or God, it's white men, right?
Right.
And the way we think and discuss and talk about Jesus as a person is often upholding these Eurocentric norms.
Mm.
And what that has led to is a dehumanization of people who aren't white or people who don't perform whiteness.
Right.
And so I think that's been part of the reason why, and that's also led to a disconnecting from non-human nature as something we can control and objectify,
Mm.
because that's a part of white body supremacy, right? And
Exactly.
so I outline all this stuff in the book. So I'm giving you like a Cliff Notes version of how I outlined it on the book because it was a
Right.
journey, and I can make it sound academic, but I would tell you that it's very conversational. It's rooted in. I tell my own story
Right.
of what happened to my diet. I become a vegan as a consequence of doing this. Not
Mm-hmm.
for the animals. I mean, I think most people I meet that are vegans are like, oh, I love animals. Don't get me wrong, animals are great. Don't come at me with the anti-animal angle. I love animals. It's just for me, it was much more about the way the industry of animal agriculture and agriculture as such harms people of color. And I didn't want to be
Mm.
complicit in harming my community. And honestly, this is a community that predominantly now looks more like you, right? I mean, this is
Mm-hmm.
mostly Latinx folks now and
Right.
immigrant,
Right.
African immigrants mostly in
Right.
these places. And if we are going to be people of faith who side with the oppressed, right?
Mm.
This
Right.
is among the most oppressed groups in America. Not only farm workers, but actual farmers.
Right.
I write in the book like farmers always rank is in the last 50 years. They've ranked in the top 3 of professions that commit suicide.
Hmm.
It is farmers. It's some order of farmers, dentists, and veterinarians. It's been like that actually for
Wow.
the last 30 years. But those
Wow.
3 change because farming is such thin margins,
Mm.
and so much of the money that we spend in farming goes to large corporations and not actual
Right.
farmers. They're
Right.
always living check to check trying to make ends meet.
Right.
And so it isn't just about like black people or Latinx folks. It's about like people in our food system who are just,
Right.
I mean, if something happens to them, like I can't really grow no real food. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm
Yeah.
like we
Yeah.
saw this in the pandemic, right? When the supply chain
Exactly.
gets messed up, people go hungry, and so we
Exactly.
need to take this seriously as people of faith and think critically about how our faith should shape what it is we eat and how we think about our food system. So
Mm.
that's what the book is an invitation to do.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that wonderful overview, and again for putting this together. And it's I think it's so practical too and accessible too, right? Like that, like you said, you can make it sound very academic, or but at the end of the day, there's no humanity without food, right? There is no life without food, and so it's so grounding, and it's I love how you intersect spirituality into it, right, and theology, because it is a theological question, like you're asking, right, like how to respond to this. And I think oftentimes that is the question, right? Like, where is God, where is the divine in these places of hurt, in these places of pain, like you're talking about, at a driving in what a lot of people don't realize is that drive right from LA to San Francisco, the Central Valley is where the majority of our food's produced in the whole country, right? Like the that don't doesn't come from other countries, right? That's where the majority, and so there's definitely, I mean, just a plethora of farms and agricultural spaces in California here. And again, I appreciate how you're bringing it home, not only in this part of the country, but how you also intersect it with your own, family and ancestral, background, right? In terms of talking about soul food, and if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit more about how this has intersects, right, with the you mentioned racial justice, or how do you talk about soul food and its intersection with Black history, right? And in the ways in which it serves as an expression of identity and connection to ancestors, and ancestral homelands.
Yeah, so a big part of my struggle with when I answered that question in terms of, okay, how can I eat in a way that's in alignment with my values? One answer was obvious, is I needed to stop eating animals, because factory farms are
Mm,
just the worst in terms of pollution and racism. Like,
right.
that's just like just the worst. Like,
Mm,
they are some of the most polluting industries, and they're always populated around communities of color, because this is where it's like,
right.
NIMBYism, like not in my backyard. So they're
Right.
always in spaces where it's predominantly Black, Latinx, and Indigenous.
Mm,
Inside the factories, there's a racial caste and racial hierarchy where
mm,
Black people and people of color in general have the worst jobs, and white people are the ones who have the executive level positions.
mm,
And not to mention the water that we spend on the factory farms, the antibiotics and other like vital medicines that humans actually need, that we have to use on them so they
mm,
don't have other zoonotic diseases. Um, like, there's just all these ways in which you can look at the industrial animal agriculture as particularly bad for Black people. And
right.
so I was like, okay, that means I need to stop eating meat. And in so doing, how can I maintain a sense of identity as a Black man and not eat stuff I grew up eating? You know,
Mm.
and so much. And I'm already in California. I already left Michigan, which people in my family was like, I might as well move to Mars. Like, going to California from Michigan is like going to another planet. Um, I already started growing my dreadlocks at this point, so I already got locks, and so my family's already like, "Yeah, I don't know, like something's going on." And then when I'm like, "Okay, I'm gonna be a vegetarian," that's what I did at the time. I mean,
Yeah,
for them, it's just like it was a lot, and so
sure.
I needed to be I need. They felt like I was not so much they were losing me, but I was not connecting to them in the same ways. Like, they were concerned about my ability to be who I am in the midst of everything I was learning. And so for
Mm,
me, I needed to figure out a way to eat in a way that helped me feel like me, Like, so I
right.
had to so part of my pursuit was to take the things that I grew up eating, and I guess two things. It was first to take things I grew up eating and find a way to make them healthy and have them
Mm,
still taste like home. And so for me, it's like reinventing all these recipes. And then secondly was to do research on like African diasporic foodways, because what I came to
mm,
realize is so much of what we've been taught about what we eat is a part of like capitalism.
right.
Basically, like, capitalism
Exactly.
shapes so much of how people that look like you and I, like, young people of color,
Mm,
um are taught to eat, because we have so much more exposure to media than our parents did.
right.
um and so, like, my grandpa talks to him about what he ate growing up. He ate predominantly vegetarian because they couldn't afford to have meat. right? And
Mm.
that's what he ate, and they thought it was fine. He doesn't really eat that much meat anymore, like barely any at all. Enough that because his doctor says he has to because he's 90,
Right.
but like not much. And what I realized was our indigenous African diets were predominantly leafy greens, soupy
Mm.
stews with supplemented with meat,
Mm.
and that's we grew up eating beans and rice,
Right.
gumbo, like dirty rice, hop and jack.
Mm.
It's basically what we ate. That's what we,
Right.
but often we had way too much meat in it relative to what they would have had back in the day or what they ate in West Africa, and
Right.
so it was a way in which for me to kind of reclaim an identity. Not to say, okay, this is exactly what our West African ancestors ate, but to say that me eating like this is consistent with my identity as a black person, right? Like I can
Mm.
tie it back to a past that is real and tangible that still eats that way.
Mm.
And we could also use this to heal from agriculture because so much of my community, because we dealt with so much forced agriculture, people didn't want to have anything to do with like farming or growing any kind of food,
Right.
which is like totally legitimate, right? Like
Right.
um and so there's a trauma there we had to heal from, and so I wanted to have people understand that the reason we were enslaved is because of our agricultural capabilities. Like we were
Mm.
really good farmers. We knew how to grow food that Europeans struggled to grow, which is why they enslaved us. And I talk about this in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And so and so slavery is a part of our agricultural history, but not the part, right? It's a
Right.
part of our history, but it's not the defining part. And so we have to process through that and heal from that. And so that's what I try to do to help us connect to that longer history of Black culinary and agricultural practices.
Yeah, thank you so much for just giving again a synopsis of the connection, right? The intersection between your own ancestors and the food injustice system that we experience, through modern, industrial ways of growing food, right? That is such a, I mean, you alluded to it too during the pandemic, right, where we really kind of, I think for the first time, some of us, paused and actually saw like, whoa, like there's people behind the scenes, right? That oftentimes are invisible people that are producing, the things that we go to the grocery store, that we take for granted, right? To get food, regardless of what kind of food it is, right? And I think there's just so much here, like that I want to continue to ask you about, because I, again, you were like really one of the first people to kind of make these connections in my mind around how this is not only just a social economic issue, or cultural, but also very much a theological one too. And like I remember in some of your other works reading, talking about just you know um, the fact that some people are, because of economics, right, and other injustices, uh, they're going to shop at the 99-cent store. Like there's an article you wrote that, just really, was a reminder as you were sharing now, like how do we, as individuals, I guess, address something that is so large? Would you touch on that, like in terms of, because it kind of feels like there's powerlessness, right? It can feel, I should say, like there's powerlessness in these systems that feel so large. Like, and I know you touch on it in your book, but would you mind, sharing how maybe how you've experienced that, or you've seen other communities, address these injustices around food and colonization, right?
Yeah, so I guess what I say is I'll two parts. I'll talk about what I mean by decolonization and talk about like the three kind of like theological like practices basically that I outline in the conclusion of the book, that kind of I think help describe a little bit more about what it looks like in practice. And so essentially I'm talking about decolonization. Like I see decolonization as like both identifying like colonial thinking and then dismantling colonial thinking. And what I mean by colonial thinking is like when we think about colonization, you're thinking about believing that life should be at the service of institutions. So, right, think
Mm.
about the way we think about capitalism, or we think about our jobs, or these other things. Our lives are at the service of these organizations,
Mm.
and a decolonial framework asks and recognizes that these institutions should be at the service of life, right?
Mm.
That
Right.
like they should help us actually flourish rather than the other way around. And that's a simplified version of what I write in the book, but it's a helpful way, I think, of just when you're asking, say, what does it mean to decolonize? Is to colonialism is so tied up with capitalism and economics. It's
Right.
often tied with the production and consumption of goods rather than what does it mean to have people have a higher standard of baseline living so that we all might flourish. And so when I'm trying to think about it with respect to food, but just in general, I talk first thinking about what sources of knowledge that we use that have shaped our certain in our worldview, right? Like so, questioning our sources of knowledge to expand them to other sources of knowledge that aren't Eurocentric or androcentric,
Mm.
um, you know, and then to like examine and analyze the answers that we find. Like with respect to food, I talk about like what do we discover when we analyze our food system, from the our personal and communal experience. And then I think we move to the theological, and this is where we get to the anthropology section. And
Mm.
I think it's important for us to ask ourselves, who do we want to be, right? As people of faith, like who are we called to be? And then in light of that, we answer, what are we called to do? And so it really kind of moves
Right.
from like, these movements, I believe, helps us get at and create a framework, or I was trying to do, of describing what what I call soulful eating, justice for food workers, and caring for the earth. Those three theological practices.
Mm.
Soulful eating at its core is like I borrow heavily from Bell Hooks, and I call it like culinary consciousness raising.
Mm.
Like, so I'm arguing for what I describe as black veganism, but I don't need to spend a ton of time talking about that. Essentially, what I mean is I recognize that everybody can be vegan. So I ask for an agent specific and context specific veganism, meaning
Mm.
that we need to create the space and system for people to actually eat in ways that are compassionate and that care for creation. That's
Mm.
broadly spaced, broadly simple, broadly speaking, I should say. And do we do this by thinking when we're eating, right? So Bell Hooks talks
Mm.
about consciousness raising groups in her book Feminism is for Everybody. And so I try to take that with just a culinary consciousness raising, like how do we eat in ways where we think and we recognize where our food comes from, who's making it, who's suffering, who's benefiting. Like how do we actually have these kinds of conversations before we buy the food and while we're eating, right? Such
Mm.
that we begin to change. Um, and if just churches did that, right? If your
Yeah.
church organization said, you know what, we commit this year to buy foods that are fair trade, foods that are, if you're going to eat meat, stuff that comes from not factory farms, stuff that comes from actual farm where people are actually getting paid a just wage. And if you say, well, if we can't do
Right.
that, then we're going to be default veg. Like if you make this commitment, right? Like
Yeah.
that's what I mean by soulful eating, right? Like
Right.
taking and using the resources you have to do better because you know better, like you
Exactly.
know better, so then you need to do better,
Right.
and also begin to develop the practice of cooking. I think one of the most important things that we have as people of color is that we are um, a people of stories, and these
Mm.
stories is where we tell, and it's how our ancestors are not only called into remembrance, but how we allow ourselves to stay connected to them and pass on those stories to our children. Um, and
Mm.
so and so remembering and recalling this practice of cooking, I think, is crucial to soulful eating as well. And so that's what I mean by soulful eating. Justice for food workers is much more of the tangible, practical thing that I was talking about in terms of like changing the ways in which you procure food personally and especially religious organizations, right?
Right.
So if your church, I mean, people have potlucks and stuff all the time. Like, eat in a way that's in alignment with your values. If your church mission statement is about the love of Jesus and talking about loving the earth, then
Mm.
you need to buy food that reflects your mission statement.
Come on.
you know,
Come on.
and so like this is what it is. And so,
Yeah.
and so it's buying, it's going to buying stuff from a CSA, going to farmers markets, going to co-ops. And these are all things I do, right? So I'm not telling you anything I do. Like this shirt,
Right.
I love this shirt. This is a shirt that we got from a what do you call it? thrift store. Like it's
Yeah.
just trying to recognize that we have to um, change our patterns of consumerism, because so much of our consumerism is rooted in um, honestly, it's rooted in anti-ecological principles,
Hmm.
and so changing how we buy food so that we can take seriously our responsibility to increase the minimum wage and protect and help farm workers, and to move towards something called food sovereignty, so that each
Mm.
community can actually have a grocery store, and each community can have free school food, and work with organizations like the LA Food Policy Council if you're in LA.
Yeah.
And again, these are things I don't say everybody has to do all this stuff, but I give people lots of options in the book. I was like, here's some stuff you can do. And the last thing I want to say
Right.
is um, I call it as like caring for the earth, but really I'm talking about turning church land into farmland, right? So how
Mm.
can we, like where I grew up in Michigan, we had a whole just bunch of land next to our church we weren't using for anything, just
Right.
nothing. And not only could we have been growing food there to feed our community, we could have been growing food there to sell. We could have been giving people
Right.
jobs to
Right.
grow food to sell, right?
Yeah.
We could have been investing in our community to transform them, not only from a health and wellness perspective, but literally creating jobs, like what the conservatives be talking about. Like we could actually be job creators. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
like how might we use resources that we have in ways that could lead to that
Mm.
transformation, right? I think that's something that's crucial. If you don't have land like that, organizations like the Black Church Food Security Network have showed us that you can partner with other churches and connect with farmers and have like an internal farmers market in your own church, and do it in
Mm.
a way that you don't, where the farmer can make some more money because you're not charging them a bunch of overhead because you're a
Right.
nonprofit and that's what you're
Right.
supposed to do. And your people can actually eat good food that's cheaper than they can get at a grocery store. And so
Mm.
it's really trying to recognize there are multiple ways for us to embody this vision of beloved community, basically, as I try to draw out. And so that's kind of
Yes.
the principles that I lay out, and I articulate that in greater detail in the
Of
book, but
course.
that's the rough version, but it's doable, Josh. That's the thing, is like this
Yep.
isn't, it can feel overwhelming, but I'm like, it's really not. It's like you just do a couple things and you're doing
Right.
something good, and it can snowball and lead to larger systemic change.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, going touching on that last point, like that the local church, right? We have, like, obviously we are in a food system. We're in some might even call it a watershed, right? That is like, obviously in our geopolitical imaginations, like we divide land by, cities or states or countries or, these borders, right? But nature actually has systems too, in which so we're um, you know and it's all around like water, right, or food, and I think every church is in one of these spaces, right, and I think it really kind of goes into the holistic nature of spirituality, right, in your work really really highlights that in terms of like our spirituality, like you mentioned it earlier, right, about how in your experience in seminary, uh of like evil, right, and sometimes our spirituality in the Christian tradition could be like this escapism, right, where is not grounded in reality, it's not grounded in the local context, right? And like especially for those of us who got or are part of the evangelical world, right? Whereas like spirituality was all about the afterlife, it was like all about this like future, wanting to spend eternity instead of in hell and in heaven, right? And the spirituality that I think the gospel really presents is one that is very much grounded, incarnational, right? Especially as we're in this Advent season, so much so, like where our our theology teaches that our God incarnated into this world, into this local context, right, into these systems, right, and the local church, like you're saying, I think has the power to really engage ourselves to being incarnational, right? And I think through what you call soulful eating is such a great example, right, of how we could be build that beloved community, obviously with humans but with other creation too, right? Not just you know, but very much so, like there are humans that are suffering, and if we're going to be on the side of the oppressed, if we're going to be in solidarity, right? Like it does come down to feeding, right? And that's why, like, it so struck me in that article when you're talking about, like, dude, there's people that are shopping for groceries at the 99 cent store. Like my family's done that before, right? And it was just, again, it was like, in a way, I felt like seeing through that. But also, I think it's so important where we're thinking about, feeding people, right? How we can use our spaces, use our resources, to not only obviously put food on people's table and in their bellies, but also think about how we could also take care of the workers, take care of the earth itself, right? And use our spaces, like, again, every faith community has a space, right? For the most part, that can be used to also produce like I said, jobs and food, and really transformation. And again, one of your quotes that had stuck with me, that we can transform the world like one plate at a time, right? Like food could be this source that can really bring about transformation, even if it's something that we oftentimes, through capitalism, through consumerism, we don't even think, right? We don't associate, like, and then going back to like spirituality, I think that word Eucharist is about gratitude, kind of what we were talking about earlier, right? And so it is this reflective, space that I think, again, food is so central. And so again, I want to honor you and just acknowledge the work that you put into this, that like you said, you're not only writing about, but you're embodying in your own context. And just so thank you, Reverend Dr. Carter, for the work that you do, and for producing this wonderful gift, the Spirit of Soul Food. Highly recommend um, the book. And would like to just pause there if there's anything else that you would like to talk about the book, or some of your forthcoming work that you are writing.
Yeah, actually, you know what? Let me. Man, this is what's messed up. I'm like trying to remember, like, what's the name of this article I just published? This is what happens when you write probably
When
too
you
much.
you put
I'm
in the
like,
work, yeah.
I know. I'm like, what is the name of that? It's coming out on. Oh man, it's on Animals and Religion. That's the name of the edited volume. Oh, here it is, right
Okay.
here. Cancel. It is called. Let me get the title. There we go. It's called "Race, Animals, and a New Vision of the Beloved Community." And what I love about this, just to give a teaser, is I start this chapter by talking about the similarities between the animal rights movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I have these
Mm.
pictures of Trump. I don't know if you remember, before President Trump was gonna go in front of that church. He has that picture. He's holding the Bible, and it's that
Hmm.
crazy. And they like had like tear gas clear the way. So a picture of that, and I have a picture
Okay.
of these white anti-maskers in Michigan. So it's my home state, like just going crazy in front of police, and the police are just sitting there taking it.
Wow.
And I juxtapose these messages in terms of the way we think about who gets treated like and seen like an animal, and what does it mean for
Mm.
us to take that seriously, right? So that's a chapter that's coming out that I'm excited about. um, the other thing I would just say is, not if people are interested in finding out more about my work, they can uh, my website is www.drchristophercarter.com, I think. And
Yeah, we'll be
I
sure to put it in the show notes for
yeah,
sure.
but that's yeah, and I think lastly, we have a progressive theology podcast at the Loft now that I'm actually really excited about. That we actually are finishing up our series on white Christian nationalism next week. That's been really, really good. So yeah, man, just I'm kind of a little bit of everywhere. So check out some of that stuff, and anybody got any questions, they can feel free to shout me out. But I want to thank you for having me. It's
Thank you.
crazy to see how much like you've grown, as a person, as a scholar. And I'm like really proud of what I see you doing. And you and
Thank
your
you.
partner both are doing some amazing stuff, man. So it's exciting, man. It really, really is, to think back to that first time we met so long ago, to where we are now, man. It's kind of, won't he do it? That's what they say in my tradition. Won't he do it? So
Thank you. No, that means a lot coming from you. And again, you've been somebody I've looked up to for many years. So, it's such a gift to, now have you, because you were in San Diego, right, a few years back, but now you're here, and you know, the Loft and Westwood churches are a partner in the ministry we're doing too in Echo Park, and so it's great to be in solidarity. And thank you for all the work you continue to do. And I just kind of quick hitters as we conclude here. Want to ask you some final questions. Again, as you alluded to already, of holding this dual vocation, right, as a pastor and professor. How do you individually and collectively work about for holistic spirituality?
I think that's probably one of the most challenging things you have as a scholar, activist,
Mm-hmm,
pastor is
mm-hmm,
to take the time to tend to yourself. And
mm,
so, two things. One, I go to therapy. And that has been,
yes.
and I'm very open about it. It's been very helpful. I have an amazing, I have an amazing therapist. She utilizes internal family systems approach, which I highly
Mm,
recommend. It's very, um, I think it's in alignment with so much of the contemplative practices we find in the tradition of Christianity, which is the other thing
mm,
I was going to talk about is this book
right.
called Practicing Compassion
Mm-hmm,
um, by Frank Rogers. It has been like the subtitle is The Way of Jesus, or no,
mm,
it's Compassion in Practice, The Way of Jesus. And that book
okay.
has been so helpful for me in terms of developing practices that allow me to heal and to work through what's going on internally and to find a space to cultivate compassion not only for myself but for others for transformation, right? Not just like the benign thoughts and prayers, right, but actual compassion that leads to transforming communities like we see Jesus do in the Gospels. And
Mm,
so for me, holistic spirituality starts with learning to actually love yourself
mm,
such that you can actually then love others and not
yes.
see the where you look at the you see the speck in their eye and not focus on and recognize you have a log in yours, right? Like, it's
Right.
like doing the
Exactly.
internal work. It's like you do the U-turn to say what's going on
Yeah.
within me, what allows you to engage others in a more authentic way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And no, that's so such words of wisdom there, and I appreciate you sharing that. Such a believer in, and that's actually one thing that we hope of the podcast is that we do cultivate those practices of self compassion too, right? Because I totally wholeheartedly believe that unless we do that kind of internal, because oftentimes we see that even in faith spaces, where it's like people transforming the world, but there's always that I think that tension of the Mary and Martha, ways of,
Yeah.
doing the work, but also sitting at the feet of Jesus, right? And like being transformed internally, and also just appreciate you sharing that. And also just want to ask, like, if there's any, again, because uh, why we put together this project was to cultivate and share people's personal journeys. And a lot of us, we struggle, right? Like, sometimes we might be in positions as pastors or professors or other, but we don't realize those internal struggles, and just want to share, uh, have you share if there has ever been any time that you struggle with your faith, or evolved in your faith. You kind of mentioned it a little bit, but just any last stories that you would like to share as we close out here.
Yeah, I think the most relevant story. There has been times, but one story I can't share unless I have permission, which I didn't ask for, so I'm not going to share. But
Right.
another story that I want to share that's been helpful for me in expanding my notion of community was actually when my first dog died. And I know that
Mm,
sounds for some people you're like, oh, your dog, whatever. But at this time, I was just a postdoc in San Diego, and I was living by myself because my wife was finishing veterinary school up here,
mm,
and we knew our dog had cancer, and I've been taking him to get treatments and stuff like that. And
yeah.
um, but I was getting frustrated with the amount of time I was having to spend taking care of him with treatments and things like that. because it was taking away time I felt like I needed to be doing to prove myself to this organization to get this job, to
Mm.
be a tenured professor rather than postdoc.
Right.
And my dog had been there for me through so much strife and
Mm.
through marital struggles, through family struggles, through depression, and just
Mm.
held me and supported me.
Right.
Um, and so when it came time to say goodbye, and when it got to the point where we needed to, take him for euthanasia, um, I felt such deep guilt, because I did not feel like I treated him with the same level of love that he treated me in the moment of his need. Um, and Josh, I'm telling you, man, I was messed up. I was messed up because I felt shame and guilt, and I also felt embarrassed because I didn't want to tell my peers at my university that I'm all sad and depressed and full of this stuff because my dog died, and this feels so like weird. And what I realized, and so this is it took me years to really work through this, and I wrote this chapter called Prophetic Labrador, which
Mm.
is on my website, which you can find about. It's a eulogy to Samson,
Wow.
and I write how his death and me learning to work through my grief helped me expand my notion of community beyond humans, helped me
Wow.
understand that he was a part of my community in a way that was
Mm.
transformative, that allowed me to feel healed and whole at times in my life where I didn't necessarily feel that way. um
Wow.
and 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 so I think for me, that's a deeply pivotal point in my spirituality, in as much as it has continued to shape my thinking about who gets to make sure that all people are seen, and that we shouldn't
Mm.
have communities that are like, I believe in hierarchy. I mean, I'm a dad, so if you're a parent and you actually want to be a good parent, you got to believe that somebody has some power. But it doesn't need to be, it should be oppressive hierarchy, right? It doesn't need
Right.
to be oppressive, right? And I think that's what I learned more than anything from Samson,
Mm.
was what does it mean to just love, and to love in a way that expands the notion of community, that doesn't require this kind of oppressive hierarchy, but to see someone as contributing to your flourishing and well-being. And I apply it to all this other stuff in light of it. Like his death, just I use him and connect it with Cone and do some other stuff.
Wow.
It's actually the chapter is so funny. It's the chapter I get emailed about the most, because when we
Interesting.
we we have such terrible theologies of death with our companion animals. Like, so
Right.
what happens is somebody's animal dies. They're Googling stuff about and they find this article, randomly
Wow.
find this article, and I get these emails. People are just like, and I can tell they're in tears, like writing it about how this thing was so helpful for them working through their, and so in this sense, this is his story. It's his story that lives on. That's how he's alive in me, is by
Mm.
me talking about the transformation that he had on me. So thank you for letting me share that story, man. Because that
Yeah.
I don't know, it definitely it's really important for me. It's really important to me.
Thank you. Thank you. Samson presente, as we say, and I really appreciate you sharing that. You almost had me in tears too, just thinking about it. So I can't wait to check it out. And of course, we'll link it up in the show notes too, so others can as well. And again, as we conclude here, we ask this question to everybody on the podcast, but it's so appropriate, given everything we've been talking about today. If you could have 5 dinner guests, either who are present in this world, who have passed on, who would you like to share a meal with and why?
Okay, so it would be, um, Martin Luther King would be
Mm.
one, just because he's Martin Luther King and just genius, and Howard Thurman, same thing. Like two
Mm.
people just straight up, like same thing, straight up. Like that's who I want to.
Wow.
Barack Obama,
Mm.
because is Barack Obama. I'm like,
You don't
so
have to say more.
mine are like, it says like, these are like very, very obvious, people.
Yeah, of
I
course.
think, the other person would be Oprah, because I'm just always
Mm.
fascinated with like who she is, and like what she's been able to do, and how she's been able to work through and overcome everything she's been able to overcome,
Mm.
in her life. And the last one is actually Dorothy Day, um,
Mm.
because like Dorothy Day is an anarchist, and an amazing Catholic, and
Right.
like it just holds these things in tension. Just like Dory today was walking the walk, man. Like she's walking the walk, and
Definitely.
so I've always been fascinated and love reading her work. And
Mm.
have always been inspired by it. This was a hard question for me. Like I had to name the first three. Were just like these are my three, and then
Yes.
to narrow down the next two was tricky because I
Yes.
could have said probably 10 other people, but
I'm sure.
I've always been an Oprah fan. I'm like a weird, I don't be talking about it too much, but yeah, I've just always been impressed by her work and would love to learn from her. It was close between her and Ava DuVernay, to be honest, but we're with Oprah.
Love it. No, that would be a beautiful, beautiful meal for sure. And I could see Oprah kind of, facilitating
Exactly.
conversation.
I know what has to do anything. Like she would just be kind of guiding everything around. It'd be like one big super soul. It's like what you call it, Super Soul Sunday. It'd just be this one
Yes,
big meal. It'd be awesome.
exactly. No, I love it. Love it. Well, thank you so much again. And, as we're still kind of starting this podcast, we were asking people if you have any recommendations, for being a guest on the podcast.
Oh man. If you're gonna have a guest on this podcast, who would I think you should have on? Probably Isabel Harada, who
Okay.
is this Filipina young woman who's running for city council, and
Okay.
she is a bad woman in all the good ways, man. Like she is awesome. She was able to come to the loft, and unfortunately I wasn't able to be there, but I've met her a few other times, and she's doing some real work in the community. And I mean, LA City Council, as you will know, has some problematic people, and so I hope, like, I can't endorse candidates because of because
Right.
of my job, but let's
Right.
just say I would not be sad if she won. I'll just say that.
Right, right. No, thank you. Would love to connect and have her on the show. So thanks for the recommendation. And last question is, how would you define refuge?
For me, refuge is creating it's it's what I try to, how I see it is just creating a space where you can feel like you belong, but you don't have to fit in, right?
Mm,
And that's so much of what I've tried to create at the Loft community is a refuge for people who are like
mm,
theologically feel like they don't fit in anywhere. And so, but to feel safe, to feel like you can be
yes.
yourself and be seen and be
Mm,
heard and not dehumanized, and that it's okay that we all don't agree, right?
right.
But you know that you belong, right? Like you
Mm,
don't have to. That's what I mean. Like when you fit into a place, you're always like, okay, I have to believe all these things and fit all these stereotypes or whatever. But
mm,
that's not real humans. It's not how people are. Um, you should be able to be in a space and be yourself and know that in the midst of that, we can still hold you in sacred love and compassion because you belong. And so for me,
mm,
that's what I think of refuge, man. It's a space where you can belong and have to fit in and feel safe and seen and heard.
mm. Yeah, thank you for that beautiful description, and I can see it, I can feel it, and thank you for also embodying it, in the loft space and in the other work you do, and yeah, just thank you for sharing your story today, Reverend Dr. Carter. It's such a gift, and just look forward to keeping in touch. Of course, we will put all the information you shared in the show notes so that others can keep in touch with you as well, and as we say in Spanish, adelante, onward, and all the blessings, all the love and blessings.
Thanks, Josh, man. I'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good. Peace.